Hello YouTube. Before I really delve into the videos on the Hawken project, which I'm going to start another one tomorrow, I wanted to go over something on what actually is a true Hawken rifle. And the fact that most of the copies out there that you see and have been seeing for the better part of 50 years are in fact not a Hawken rifle. So what is a Hawken rifle? Well, let me actually start by going to what the copies were. In 1970, Thompson Center brought out their first muzzleloader, and that was the Hawken, their copy of it. And what they were looking at, and the gun they had the design of, they basically said, okay, well, what do we call it? And somebody goes, well, why don't we use Hawken? Because there was an interest at that time. You're getting towards the bicentennial. There was a lot of nostalgia. A couple of years after that, you had Jeremiah Johnson came out, which really made that take off. But you had interest in it. Thompson Center had this was their first muzzleloader. So what do they call it? Well, this was 1970. There was no Google. There was nothing to really look up. And they said, well, you want to heck, nobody's using it. Why don't we call it a Hawken rifle? And that's been pretty much what a Hawken rifle in modern terms has looked like ever since. In reality, the gun that they were looking at and the gun they copied was not a Hawken rifle. I'll tell you what it was after I explain what a Hawken is. A Hawken rifle, what you see in front of you is a CVA mountain rifle. That is closer to a Hawken rifle than a Hawken is. Hawken rifles, of course, made by the Hawken brothers. You had a long stretch when they were made, and then after they were bought out by a gentleman named Gemmer. Gemmer kept making up until the 1870s. And his guns looked quite a bit like the regular Hawken, because that was what was popular. But the one dead giveaway on almost all of your half-stock Hawken rifles, because they did make full-stock Hawken rifles, which looked very much like a Kentucky rifle in a way. But if you look at pretty much 99.9% of your Hawken rifles, original Hawken rifles, they have two barrel wedges. That is the dead giveaway. To a Hawken. There is, I believe, one example that I'm aware of one with a single barrel wedge. And if you look at it, it doesn't look right. There's something with the forearm and the barrel that might have been cut, and it looks like it may have been restocked. Or it could have been custom made, but that's not what they would have looked like. Hawken rifles are also notorious for having very long barrels. Very seldomly was a barrel under 32 inches. A common length was 37. They're also very heavy. Every year at the big Hawken gathering that they have out in the Midwest, they have an original Hawken rifle that you can shoot. I think you got to pay $20 so you can shoot it. That gun weighs 13 pounds. It's extremely heavy. That CVA mountain rifle right there is at least a 9-pound. I'm going to go probably on the closer end to a 10-pound gun. It's very close to what a real Hawken would look like. Most Hawkens also didn't have a patch box. Some of them did. They were an option. You could get it. That style and a round style one tended to be more common. The other thing is a lot of the original Hawkens were not stocked in brass. That was usually iron or German silver. Most of your copies are brass, and there's a reason for that, because the original guns that they based it off of were brass. They were brass stock. Why? Brass is cheaper. It was a lesser metal, especially, it might be more expensive now, but it was definitely less expensive in those days. The two books that are there, the Hawken Rifle by Bob Woodville and the Hawken Rifle, Its Place in History by Charles Hanson, are excellent sources on all of this. Woodville is probably by far the expert on Hawkens. He's been studying them for decades. There isn't, I don't think, anybody that's even close alive anymore that could compare with him when it comes to the knowledge of Hawken rifles. I don't think it's even a matter of comparison. Um, he even says that the guns aren't at all, the new guns are basically just what somebody looked at and said, here you go, and they slapped it on there. So what are the guns that are advertised now as Hawkens? This would be the single barrel wedge brass spring guns. So what were they modeled after? Well, they're a combination, either a Leman trade rifle or a Dimick rifle, and I'll go over who those guys were. Horace Dimick was a gun maker from St. Louis. He started in 1849. He made all sorts of different rifles. Pretty much, you know, he had like a plains rifle, he had a short rifle, but the rifle that he is best known for was issued to Colonel John Burge's Western Sharpshooters in 1861, also known as a 66 Infantry, 66 Illinois Infantry. These guns, they bought about 150 of them. The rest of the regiment bought Henrys out of their own pocket. They went from 1861 up until they got to Atlanta. By the time they got to Atlanta, the guns were worn out. There is, as far as I know, one surviving example, and it's in excellent condition. And it looks like what you would see a modern Hawken. It's a shorter barrel, it's double set triggers, and it's got brass hardware. It has that more traditional look of a Hawken, what you would think a Hawken looks like, and a copy of a Hawken than a real Hawken looks like. And you know, Dimick kept making guns, but he ended up going bankrupt in 1873, died in 1874. Not a lot is really heard about his guns, other than just the Illinois infantry guns. The other gun it could be that they could have copied is a Leman Indian trade rifle. Henry Leman, another gun maker, 1834, he started in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Leman almost exclusively sold as his guns as trade guns to the Indians. He was almost notorious for that. And people might think, well, jail is a bad thing. Up until 1866, the United States government allowed you to do that. In 1866 is when the United States government said, all right, no more guns to the Indians. In 1877, a number of guns were captured from the Sioux and the Cheyenne. Of those guns, 94 were Lemans, 6 were Henrys, and 6 were Hawkens. To give you an idea of how popular and how widespread his guns were with the Indians. Now, his guns look a great deal like what you would see as the traditional Hawken, but they had a single set trigger instead of a double set. But they had the brass hardware, a short barrel, and that short half stock with a single barrel wedge. He did make long barrel guns, he did make smooth bores, he did make long, almost like Kentucky looking guns. But he was a direct competitor with Hawken. And his guns, just like Dimick was also a direct competitor with Hawken. But the Leman guns were cheaper. They were cheaper quality, they weren't as nice, they weren't as refined. The Dimick guns were pretty much right there as far as quality goes. But and sometimes they actually preferred, versus the Illinois infantry, they preferred the Dimicks over the Hawken because they believed because they were a lighter gun. They weren't going to have to lug around. Nobody wanted to lug around a 10+ pound rifle. The Dimicks were somewhat lighter. So that's where you get the copies from. And of course, Thompson Center, 1970, brought out theirs. That was the first muzzleloader. Then they brought out the Renegade. Then they brought out the Thompson Center Seneca, which was essentially a small caliber Hawken. That was a 36 and 45 caliber gun. I happen to have a 45 caliber Seneca, and it's a very short, lightweight gun. In 1981, CVA brought out their Hawken. Again, the mountain rifle here in front of you looks more like a Hawken than their Hawken does. And of course, CVA's gun is just basically a copy of the Thompson Center gun. And then of course, CVA later on stopped doing the traditional side locks. Traditions picked up the Hawken. They more or less copied the CVA to some extent. You know, the difference between the CVA Hawken and the Traditions Hawken. for the most part, is the rear sight on the traditional gun is a plastic sight. Now it's adjustable, but it's more plastic, whereas the CVA sight's all metal. It's the gun I picked up, if you've seen the last video that I've been working on, is a CVA Hawken. Although by the time I'm done with the Hawken project, I might not even be calling it that anymore. I'm probably going to refer to it more as a Dimick, because to me it looks more like, that design looks more like the Dimick that I've got a picture of. And that did belong to a member of the 66th Illinois Infantry. So if you wanted to buy a modern, true Hawken, what would you get? Well, you could try to find the InvestArms Gemmer Hawken. A lot of people get thrown by that. They don't know what Gemmer meant. And Gemmer, of course, is the guy who bought Hawken from the Hawken brothers. But he kept the name, but it's known as a Gemmer Hawken. It looks a lot like this, the mountain rifle. It's InvestArms. It's the same company who, up until recently, a couple years ago, was making the guns for Leman. Your Leman guns, your Leman Great Plains. Any of your Leman guns with the double barrel, the two barrel keys like that look like this. The Great Plains guns. They're closer to a Hawken than the Hawkens are. The Hawken copy. Pedersoli makes a copy of a high quality Hawken. If you can find one. They're hard to get and very expensive. The Traditions mountain rifle is basically a copy of the CVA mountain rifle. The rear sight, as far as I can tell, is pretty much identical to this one. That is probably, for the money, the closest version of a Hawken, along with the Gemmer Hawken that you're going to get. If I was to recommend a close copy, or even a more Hawken-looking gun than a Hawken, in my opinion, it would be the Traditions mountain rifle. The rear sight is identical to this one. It's just a bigger caliber. I believe it's 50 caliber. This gun, again, being 45. So this one isn't really what you call a true Hawken because it's a lighter barrel. But it's pretty much, it's still that same guise of a Hawken. And if you look at, even you watch the movie Jeremiah Johnson. I was going through the still photos of that the other night. If you look at that gun, you'll see the patch box looks like it's not the same type of box as this. It's a bigger patch box, which is what you'd see on the Hawkens. From what I can tell of the barrel, it appears that there's two barrel wedges on that gun. This is the gun that he finds later in the movie, the big 50 caliber. That gun looks more like a Hawken than the copies that were out at that time. That gun, good chance that was a Green River Rifle Works gun, because Green River Rifle Works was the only one up in the early 70s that was making true copies of Hawken rifles. Then Ithaca jumped in and Navy Arms jumped in, and that's pretty much, there was only a handful. Other than that, you had to rely on a gun that wasn't a Hawken. You had to rely on the top and center, and then later on the CVA. But they were advertised, and most people had no idea that these guns were not Hawkens. If you even look at the Cody Museum in Wyoming, happens to have John Johnston's rifle. John Johnston is Jeremiah Johnson. That's who he really was. That's who they based that movie off of. To the point that when they reinterred his body, when they moved it, Robert Redford was one of the pallbearers. And there's videos of that gun being shot on YouTube. I have a photo of Johnston's gun. I have a photo of, in this book here is Kit Carson's Hawken rifle. And you see how they all look very much the same. They had a close resemblance to this gun right here, like the CVA mountain rifle. So, again, if you're going to go out and look for a Hawken rifle, a copy of a Hawken, my guess is if you're going to find, again, look for something like the Traditions, but be aware that if you go out and buy what is advertised as a Hawken rifle, it's most likely not. It's most likely a copy of a Dimick rifle or a Leman Indian trade rifle. And with that being said, YouTube, have a good day.